This module is intended to provide an introduction and overview of public budgeting and financial management. Let's begin with the definition of public finance. Miller provides a fairly comprehensive definition of public finance as having four elements. So according to him, public finance refers to the many official, professional, and economic activities that collectively provide the funding and financial management for public goods, services, and facilities. So, public finance is about the collective official, professional, and economic activities that are associated with the funding and financial management of resources needed for the delivery of public goods, services, and facilities. Given this definition, let's think about what would be included under the heading of public finance. Can you think of two official, professional, or economic activity that would be classified under the heading of public finance? How do these activities provide the funding and financial management for public goods, services, and facilities? Now that we have a basic idea of what public finance is, we can talk about the two public finance concepts underpinning this course. We'll start with budgeting, and then we'll talk about financial management. First, let's broadly define budgeting and then apply budgeting to the public sector. The basic budgeting problem is, on what basis should it be decided that we allocate X dollars to activity A instead of to activity B? So when we think about that in the context of the public sector, the basic budgeting problem becomes about making decisions regarding the allocation of scarce public resources among competing economic and social objectives. As Lewis and Hildreth note, public budgeting is fundamentally about making choices about scarce resources for the fiscal period through the political process. So public budgeting, in making these allocation decisions, determines who gets, who pays, and who and what wins or loses. So for example, if we decide to address the federal deficit by raising taxes on the rich, then this budgeting decision has implications for who pays, in this case the rich, who gets or who benefits, in this case maybe the public in general, who wins, let's say the Democrats, who loses, let's say Republicans, and then what other interests, for example business interests, that win or lose. Public financial management, on the other hand, has to do with issues after resource allocation decisions have been made. So specifically, in light of budgeting and resource allocation decisions, public financial management deals with concerns or issues related to the management, the oversight, the control, and the accountability of the public resources. So public financial management may be concerned with how effectively or how efficiently public resources are used. It may also be concerned with whether the resources were used for the proper purposes and reflective of citizen preferences. So now that we have a better idea of what public finance, public budgeting, and public financial management are, we can talk about the importance of all three concepts. Specifically, why is public budgeting and financial management so important that you are required to take a course in public budgeting and financial management as part of the MBA curriculum? And for those MBA students, why should we treat public finance differently from corporate or business finance? And ultimately, why are the public sector's finances important? First and foremost, as Lewis and Hildreth point out, public finance is an excellent arena for studying and examining democratic principles. This is because budgeting, in the democratic context, involves issues of accountability. It involves issues of transparency, responsiveness, stewardship, and efficiency. It's about public scrutiny and it's about public participation. Therefore, it makes sense for an MPA curriculum to include a course that highlights all of these important elements of democracy. There are other reasons, and we'll talk about those or illustrate kind of how those are important and why they're important for MPA students and public sector practitioners to understand. Let's move on to the question of why we should treat public finance differently from corporate or business finance. Now, modern public finance does borrow liberally from the tools and concepts of business finance, but the public sector's finances also differ in terms of, for example, resource constraints and the fact that the government has the ability to tax. There are also differences in terms of ownership. While the private sector may have many shareholders, the public sector has many different public stakeholders. And in terms of objectives, in the private sector, we might have one bottom line, which is profits. But for the public sector, there are many competing values that are not easily quantified like we would think about profits. Another key difference has to do with informational needs. Budgeting and resource allocation decisions in corporations or businesses are often based on information related to supply and demand, about revenues or about costs, and at the end of the day, driven by the need for profits. For the public sector, however, informational needs may involve revenues and costs, but there are also a lot of other issues such as electoral demands, citizen preferences, intergovernmental factors, and policy priorities. The third question that we posed had to do with why we should care about public sector's finances. Public budgeting is the core decision-making process in the public sector. Public finance decisions have profound implications for the way society does and does not work. So budget and resource allocations reflect policies that society feels important, or as Lewis and Hildreth note, public budgeting is about how the players use shared resources and which problems they put on the public agenda. So issues surrounding the public purse not only have policy and operational implications, they may also have heavy moral and ethical context. The public purse is also important in light of three issues. The first is the size of government. The second is the provision of government goods and services. And the third has to do with implications of government spending. So let's think about what is a budget. While the budget has the primary role of defining resource allocations for the public sector entity, it also serves a variety of other functions. What do you think some of these functions may be? Lewis and Hildreth define the budget as a future-looking statement of government purposes, public policy, and shared values. It's a legally enforceable plan of operations that's expressed in dollars and for a specified time period. It's a way to assign financial, human, and other resources to selected uses through political processes, also for a specified time period. It's also a record of the accommodations and agreements and the wins and losses made in the political process. So therefore, at the end of the day, the budget can be seen as a reflection of how responsive government is to its citizens. It's a reflection of power, where the ones with the most power get what they want. It's a measure also of how efficient and effective government is or can be. And it's a reflection of government's priorities in terms of purposes, public policy, and shared values. Alternatively, budgeting can also be thought of as a policy process. It can be thought of as a game where there are losers and there are winners. It can be thought of in terms of politics. The budget can be thought of as the expression of policy and values, but also as a tool of fiscal and or economic policy. I want to conclude this module with a brief discussion of what makes a good budget. According to Lewis and Hildreth, a good budget performs 5 major tasks. First, it shows reasonable, responsible, and a balanced relationship between spending and revenues for the same fiscal period. A good budget also provides information for policymaking, public scrutiny, and accountability. It also serves legal and political purposes by, first of all, meeting legal obligations and requirements, then by aiding in decision making by being timely and addressing what is important in budgetary politics, and lastly, by being understandable and comprehensive. A good budget also preserves the leader's credibility and public confidence by presenting comparable, consistent, accurate, reliable, and valid data, analyses, and explanations. And finally, a good budget is also one that's persuasive and speaks to the target audience. Lewis and Hildreth use the political perspective, but you could think about the definition of a good budget from an economic perspective. And so that might focus more on issues of cost efficiency or economic efficiency. You may also think about it from a performance or outcome perspective. And so there you might be concerned with issues of effectiveness or impact. You could also think about it from some other perspectives. So for example, thinking about it from the perspective of social equity or social justice. When we put everything together, budgeting then is about the allocation of resources. It's about planning. It's about politics, policy, about choices and process. But that takes place in a political context, in complex settings, through repetitive interactive processes that are influenced by formal and informal actors, bound by internal and external constraints, and that are also strongly influenced by the external environment. If we then apply the discussion of what is a budget and what is budgeting to the federal government, the federal budget can be defined as a plan for how the federal government spends money, a plan for how the federal government pays for its activities, a plan for how the federal government can borrow and the repayment of that borrowing. It's something that affects the economy. It's something that is affected by the economy and is also a historical record. This definition can also be applied to other government budgets as well. Budgeting and planning are very closely linked. Budgeting results in a fiscal plan that supports planning, action, and control. How does this budget result in this plan? Budgeting is a complex decision process where organizational policy is formulated. That's kind of the planning side. Action programs are put into effect, the action side, and where strategic and management controls are established. So here's the control element. So in this context, budgeting then reflects the resource allocation decisions that have been made. It formulates and reflects organizational and or governmental policy. It guides policy implementation and establishes the basis for strategic and managerial control.